Hello, today I'm doing the Contradictions Book Tag. I was very kindly tagged by Angie at Bookaholic Brown Nymph. I'll make sure to leave a link to her video in the description below, as well as the original tag creator. And I like the idea of this tag because I think it speaks to the complexity of reading taste, where you might think you love certain things in books, and then it just doesn't seem to work. There are certain exceptions, or the opposite, where you are convinced you won't love a certain genre or type of book or trope, and then you find yourself proven wrong, which is often the case for me. So here we go. Number one is love the genre, didn't love the book. And I don't have a simple answer for this because my answer is going to be Michael J. Sullivan's Theft of Swords, the first book, The Crown Conspiracy. That's the only one I've read in that bind up. But I feel a little unfair saying this one. Now, I didn't quite feel very connected to this story, but I think part of the problem was I was reading this at the same time as I was reading Joe Abercrombie's Before They Are Hanged, and that was right when I fell in love with Joe Abercrombie. So I kind of wonder if I had read this at a different time, if I would have had a different experience. And I feel like that's so unfair to compare the two writing styles because they were going for very different things. They have two very different flavors of fantasy, very different approach to humor. And I liked what Michael J. Sullivan was going for, of course, with this wonderful friendship between Royce and Hadrian, this whole adventure, this exciting this sort of Princess Bride sort of vibe he has going on in that book. But unfortunately, like I said, it just didn't quite engage me to the extent that I wanted, and I do hope to give Michael J. Sullivan another try because I've heard that he writes exceptional female characters. And then number two, rarely read this genre, loved this book. And my answer for that, first I'm going to go ahead and go with Into the Wild by Jon Krakauer. Now, actually, my favorite Jon Krakauer book, I've only read two, but I actually prefer Into Thin Air, which is his survival account of Mount Everest and the tragedy that ensued on that journey. But I also really enjoyed his book Into the Wild, which was not about him, but about this young man who comes from a well to do family and ends up kind of giving it all up to go on this journey, this sort of quest he has to sort of find himself. He's very inspired by the books he reads, including Jack London, and he goes to Alaska and you learn about what happens there. So it's very much like a wanderlust kind of story, and it is based on a true story. And I loved the movie, by the way. The movie is fantastic. It has an excellent soundtrack. Overall, I don't normally read stories like that, especially ones that are nonfiction and survival quests like that. So that's kind of its own category. But of course, I loved both of Krakauer's books. But another answer I have for this is Adrian Tchaikovsky's Guns of the Dawn, which is a standalone. And I don't normally pick up flintlock fantasy. I did read the Powder Mage book by Brian McClellan, the first one, but I didn't feel compelled to continue. But I do think that Tchaikovsky blended that sort of historical fiction, military fantasy, sort of setting, swamp setting really well with this. And there's a love triangle. There's this wonderful female protagonist, Emily Marshwick, who is a noblewoman, and you find out how she ends up a soldier in this war. And it goes into some interesting themes too about at what point is surrender the more noble cause, and women in the military and the clash between military and class. And I really enjoyed the plot in this story. I thought it wrapped up in an interesting way and subverted some tropes I wasn't expecting. So, very satisfying ending, great standalone, and definitely not a genre I typically pick up. Number three, love this trope, didn't like this book. And my answer for this is I always love school settings or academic settings in fantasy, and I typically love the mentor trope. That's one of my favorite tropes of all time. However, I read this book, The Glass Speed Game by Herman Hesse, and I really struggled with it. This one put me in a reading slump for over a year. Now, I have to say that part of that might have had to do with expectation. I think I was expecting this book to be a much more plot-driven book than it was. And I don't know, there were a couple of things I think that maybe made this not quite for me, but it was gifted to me from one of my former mentors. And so I greatly appreciate it for that. And I have to say that even though I didn't quite connect with it and maybe had the wrong expectations going in, I do think that there were some passages that were stunning. There was one passage in here that brought me to tears. I thought it was so beautifully written. So it was worth the read, even though I really struggled with it and it took me forever to get through. But like I said, it's also got, of course, a mentor trope. And actually, the mentor relationship is fairly good. It has an academic setting, it does blend in philosophy and aesthetics. You don't really understand what the glass bead game is, or at least I didn't understand what it was. So that was one of the reasons I felt like this book either went over my head or just I didn't have the right expectations going in. But that's definitely my answer for this. Number 4 is hate this trope, loved this book. And this isn't really a trope, but I just have to kind of twist it into a trope just as an excuse to talk about this book. And that is going to be low stakes in fantasy. And the book I'm choosing for that is Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree, which I read recently and reviewed recently. I loved this book. But if you had told me that there was a really good fantasy standalone that had low stakes and that's a slice of life fantasy, I don't know that that would have really sold the book for me. But for some reason, I got a good feeling off this book. And I was so glad that I read it because I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I think that that description actually was perfect. And somehow that fit a need I think I had, or at least a lot of readers have right now, because a lot of fantasy these days is all about the high stakes and making death mean something and putting in an investment of time, investing in a series and expecting sort of delayed gratification. And this was so different. This was so lighthearted and warm. It wasn't the most epic world building or anything like that, but it was just perfect. So I have to go with Legends and Lattes and say the low stakes, slice of life, cozy fantasy book that I didn't even know I needed. And then next is loved this author, didn't like this book. And so for this, even though I just gushed about Abercrombie earlier in this video, I'll be honest and say that I was not super in love with The Blade itself, the first book. I did love the character work. I thought that Abercrombie had an excellent writing style. I enjoyed the humor, but I did get bored about 70% into the book, around that point anyway, and I just wasn't sure I'd want to continue the series, and I'm so glad I did because actually, like I said, book 2, Before They're Hanged, was when I was completely sold on the first law. And I do look back more fondly at The Blade itself after having finished the trilogy and after seeing what he was going for, but it was not love at first read with that first book. I did struggle through it, and I might have not continued had I not heard such exceptional praise for the trilogy. I just realized I skipped one, and that is love this author, didn't like this book. And my answer to that is going to be a bit unpopular probably, but it's The Burning God by R.F. Kuang. Now, I really enjoyed the Poppy War trilogy overall. I had a good time with it. I would still recommend it. However, I was not thrilled with the direction The Burning God went plot-wise. I did not like the ending. I do think she improved as a writer from like a technical standpoint. However, I just was not thrilled with the direction it went. I didn't there's a lot to say, but of course I can't go into that without spoilers. However, I am still really looking forward to what she comes up with next, and I really enjoyed what she did with the Poppy War trilogy because I think for me it brought attention to a part of the history of China that I hadn't paid attention to before, and I really enjoyed the complexity of this very unlikable protagonist, Rin. And I will be picking up Babel, the book that comes out later this year, actually on my birthday. And looking forward to seeing what else R.F. Kuang has in store because I think she has a lot of talent as a writer. And I did, like I said, enjoy the Poppy War trilogy overall, even though I do have some criticisms. Next is love this cover, didn't like this book. 100% has to be Daughter of the Moon Goddess by Su Lin Tan, I read earlier this year. And I think the cover to this book is stunning. I didn't buy it though. I checked out the audiobook through my library. It just wasn't for me. I think it read too young. I wasn't the right audience for it. It was a good Chinese fantasy, very whimsical, had a love triangle, but I just didn't quite click with it, and I can understand why others do. The cover is still gorgeous though. Number 8, don't like this cover, loved this book. And my answer to that is Brandon Sanderson's Warbreaker. I can't stand the cover to that book, at least the one that I'm thinking of. Now, I did check out the audiobook for this through my library as well, so I never bought it. And I don't really plan on rereading the book anytime soon or at all, I don't think. So I probably won't be collecting this book. I'll probably check it out from the library if I do decide to reread it someday. But actually, I like the audiobook art much, much more than the cover art, the traditional cover art. And so that's kind of weird. And I wonder if I'm not alone in that. I think a lot of people probably are not big fans of the Warbreaker cover art. It's just not that pretty. That concludes the tag. Next, I'm going to tag some people. First person I'm going to tag is Bookish Chaz, followed by Fiend Reads, Circe's Booked, also Ursi. I always want to call her Ursi's Booked, but Ursi is her name. Circe's Booked, and J.R. Carell, who's a new booktuber and also an author, so go check him out. Please subscribe to him and all these channels. And if you want to do this tag, consider yourself tagged. No pressure to do the tag if you are tagged, but I think this one is kind of fun. So thank you so much for watching and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.